The phone in Delia's cardigan pocket had been recording for 11 minutes before anyone at that table said a single word. She couldn't have predicted. 11 minutes of clinking silverware, of her mother-in-law complimenting the pot roast, of ordinary Sunday dinner noise. And then her husband's brother leaned across the table, lowered his voice just enough to sound careful, and said the sentence that would end up playing on a courtroom speaker 8 months later. Delia didn't plan to record anything that night. She'd only turned on her voice memo app because her therapist had suggested she start keeping a journal of family gatherings, just small audio notes to herself afterward, a way of processing the strange tension she could never quite name but always felt sitting at that table. She'd meant to record her own reflections in the car on the drive home. Instead, her thumb had slipped, or maybe some instinct deeper than conscious thought had made the decision for her, and the app had been running silently in her pocket through the entire meal. She had no idea, passing the mashed potatoes and laughing at her father-in-law's terrible jokes, that she was sitting at a table full of people who had already decided, months earlier, exactly how her life was going to end. This is the story of the dinner that exposed a betrayal so complete, so calculated, that even after Delia played the recording for a room full of lawyers, several of them asked her to play it again, certain they must have misheard. Delia Whitfield had married into the Ashcombe family 6 years earlier, and for most of that time, she'd genuinely believed she'd found the warm, chaotic, loving extended family she'd never had growing up as an only child of 2 quiet academics. Her husband, Theo, was the middle of 3 siblings, sandwiched between his older brother Callum and his younger sister Reagan. And Sunday dinners at his parents' house had become the anchor of Delia's week, the one fixed point in an otherwise unpredictable life running a small architecture firm with Theo. What Delia didn't fully understand, not in those early years, was that the Ashcombe family fortune, built over 3 generations through a chain of regional hardware stores that had eventually sold to a national retailer for an enormous sum, came with an equally enormous and quietly enforced set of rules about who deserved access to it and who didn't. Theo's parents, Marguerite and Holt Ashcombe, had structured almost everything around a family trust that would eventually distribute to the 3 siblings and their spouses upon Marguerite and Holt's deaths. It was the kind of money that made everyone at that table polite in a particular, careful way. The way people are polite when enormous stakes are quietly sitting underneath every conversation about who's hosting Thanksgiving. Delia hadn't married Theo for the money. She'd married him because he made her laugh in the specific, effortless way that felt like coming up for air after years of holding her breath. But she was about to learn that not everyone in that family believed her reasons were as simple as they seemed. The trouble had actually started 18 months before that dinner, though Delia wouldn't understand the full shape of it until much later. Theo had been diagnosed with an aggressive but treatable form of lymphoma, and the 18 months of treatment that followed had drained not just their savings, but something harder to name in both of them. Delia had taken a leave of absence from the firm to manage his care. Theo had lost 30 pounds and most of his hair, and for a while, most of his ability to imagine a future at all. He'd survived. The scans had come back clear 4 months before that dinner, and the family had thrown a small celebration for it. Tears and champagne and Marguerite hugging Delia, so tightly she'd nearly cried from the force of it. Delia had believed, in that moment, that whatever quiet tensions had ever existed in this family had been burned away by gratitude for Theo simply being alive. She had no idea that gratitude wasn't actually the emotion sitting underneath the surface of that celebration at all. The dinner that changed everything happened on an ordinary Sunday in October, the kind of crisp fall evening that made the Ashcombe family's sprawling colonial house look like something out of a furniture catalog. Delia arrived early to help Marguerite in the kitchen, as she always did, chopping vegetables and listening to her mother-in-law's stories about the neighborhood's history with the particular patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed the ritual. Callum arrived next with his wife, Petra, a sharp, ambitious corporate attorney who'd always treated Delia with a kind of distant, evaluating courtesy that Delia had spent years telling herself was simply Petra's personality rather than anything pointed. Reagan came last, alone as usual, freshly returned from what she described only as a work thing in Denver, that nobody at the table ever pressed her to explain in more detail. Theo arrived straight from a client meeting, kissing Delia's cheek and sliding into the seat beside her with the easy, unguarded happiness of a man who genuinely believed, after 18 brutal months, that the hardest chapter of his life was finally behind him. Dinner began the way it always began. Holt said a brief, gruff grace. Marguerite fussed over whether the roast was too dry. Petra mentioned a case she was working, something involving a corporate trust dispute that made her eyes light up in a way Delia had learned meant everyone else should simply nod along. It was, by every visible measure, an entirely unremarkable Sunday dinner. It was somewhere around the 11-minute mark, while Delia was quietly recording nothing more dramatic than the sound of gravy being passed, that Callum set down his fork, glanced toward the kitchen doorway to make sure the housekeeper had stepped out, and said the words that would eventually be played back in a conference room full of very serious people. So the timeline still works if we move before the annual trust review in March, Callum said, his voice pitched low but not nearly low enough. Petra confirmed it. As long as Theo's competency status is documented before the review date, we control the reallocation vote regardless of what Delia thinks she's entitled to. Delia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She kept her face carefully neutral, the way she'd learned to do at client meetings when a project was quietly falling apart behind a polished presentation, and said nothing at all, because some instinct she couldn't fully explain told her that whatever was happening at this table was happening in a language she needed to understand fully before she let anyone know she'd heard it. Competency status, Marguerite repeated, and something in her tone wasn't confused. It was clarifying, the tone of someone confirming details in a plan they'd already agreed to. The lymphoma relapse risk gives us the medical grounds, Petra said smoothly, cutting a piece of roast as though she were discussing the weather. Dr. Alderman's report already flags cognitive risk factors from the treatment protocol. We don't need him actually incompetent. We just need enough documented ambiguity that the trust committee defers the vote to next of kin instead of spouse. Delia felt something cold slide down through her chest, settling somewhere behind her ribs. Theo, beside her, was laughing at something his father had just said, entirely oblivious to the conversation happening 4 feet away. Entirely unaware that the people he trusted most in the world were discussing his medical file as though it were a legal instrument. And once the vote defers to next of kin, Reagan said, finally speaking for the first time all night, her voice carrying the particular casualness of someone who'd rehearsed this exact sentence. Delia's out of the distribution structure entirely. She was never blood. She just gets whatever's in their joint accounts, which frankly, considering what she's spent on his treatment, isn't going to be much of anything. Nobody at that table laughed. Nobody flinched either. It was said and received the way people discuss a spreadsheet, a formality, a technical adjustment to a plan that had apparently been under quiet construction for longer than Delia could yet understand. She's been remarkably useful though, Marguerite added, and Delia had to force herself to keep breathing normally, to keep her hands steady around her water glass. All that time off work managing his care. It's actually helped our case considerably. Nobody questions a devoted wife's motives while she's still playing the devoted wife. Delia sat through the rest of that dinner in a kind of controlled, silent free fall, nodding at the right moments, laughing at Holt's joke about the neighbor's dog, passing the salt when Callum asked for it. All while some part of her brain was replaying, on an endless loop, the sentence she's been remarkably useful and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the family she'd trusted for 6 years had apparently spent the worst 18 months of her life, quietly building a legal case to erase her from it entirely the moment it became convenient. She had absolutely no idea, driving home that night with Theo humming along to the radio beside her, that the 11-minute mark of that recording was only the beginning of what she was about to uncover. Delia didn't tell Theo that night. She sat in their bathroom after he'd fallen asleep, headphones in, listening to the recording 3 times through, transcribing every word by hand in a notebook she kept in her sock drawer, trying to determine whether what she'd heard was actually as monstrous as it sounded or whether grief and exhaustion had somehow distorted her ability to interpret an ordinary family conversation about estate planning. By the 3rd listen, there was no ambiguity left to hide behind. The words were exactly what they'd sounded like the first time. Her husband's family had been discussing, in specific legal terms, how to manufacture the appearance of cognitive incompetence using his cancer treatment records in order to strip her out of a trust distribution before it could ever legally include her. The next morning, Delia called in sick to the firm, something she'd done maybe twice in 6 years, and drove to the office of an attorney she'd found through a late-night search that had started with the phrase family trust fraud spouse exclusion, and ended 3 hours later with a name that kept appearing across multiple forums specializing in exactly this kind of quiet, sophisticated family betrayal. Odalise Marchetti's office occupied the 11th floor of a downtown building that smelled like fresh coffee and expensive carpet. She was a trust litigation attorney in her 50s with the unhurried, unshockable demeanor of someone who had, over 3 decades, heard nearly every version of families turning on each other over money. Delia played the recording for her without saying a word first, watching Odalise's expression shift from professional neutrality to something sharper as the audio played through Callum's opening line, through Petra's clinical explanation of the medical loophole, through Reagan's casual dismissal, through Marguerite's final, devastating comment about Delia's usefulness. When it ended, Odalise sat back in her chair for a long moment before speaking. "How long have you been married to him?" 6 years. "And this recording? Are you certain the audio hasn't been edited or taken out of context in a way that could be challenged?" "It's continuous. 11 minutes before that section starts. 40 minutes of ordinary dinner conversation after it. My phone recorded the entire meal by accident. I hadn't meant to record anything at all." Odalise nodded slowly. "That accident may be the single most important piece of evidence I've encountered in a trust fraud case in 15 years. Delia, do you understand what they were actually describing?" "I think so. But I'd like you to explain it to me anyway, because I keep hoping I've misunderstood." Odalise leaned forward. "They were describing a plan to falsify or selectively frame your husband's medical records to manufacture legal grounds for a competency challenge, timed specifically before the annual trust review, for the express purpose of triggering a clause that would exclude you from a distribution structure you would otherwise be legally entitled to as his spouse. That's not aggressive estate planning, Delia. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. And depending on how Dr. Alderman's report was actually altered or selectively presented, it may also constitute medical records fraud and potentially insurance fraud, given how his treatment was billed." Delia felt the room tilt slightly. They'd actually change his medical records? They said they don't need him actually incompetent. They said they need enough documented ambiguity. That phrasing suggests someone is either selectively presenting real medical information out of context, or actively altering it. Either way, we need to find out immediately what Dr. Alderman's actual, unaltered report says, because if there's a discrepancy between what he actually documented and what your family is planning to submit to the trust committee, that discrepancy is your entire case. Delia thought about the past 18 months, about every appointment she'd sat through beside Theo, holding his hand through infusions, memorizing the names of medications she never expected to need to remember, and felt something that had been fear only minutes earlier begin hardening into something considerably more useful. What do I do first? First, we get you legal standing before they can act. Then we find out exactly what's already been set in motion, because Delia, if they were talking about a March deadline, and this dinner already happened in October, they may already be further along in this plan than you realize. Odalise was right. Within a week, working with a forensic document specialist Odalise brought in named Ferris Okonkwo, Delia learned just how far along the Ashcombe family's plan had actually progressed, and the discovery made the dinner recording feel, in retrospect, almost quaint compared to what had already been quietly built behind her back. Ferris specialized in medical records forensics, the kind of meticulous document tracing that could identify exactly when a file had been accessed, altered, or selectively excerpted. Working with a limited medical records release that Delia, as Theo's spouse, was still legally entitled to obtain, Ferris pulled Dr. Alderman's complete, original treatment file and compared it against a summary document that had mysteriously already been submitted to the trust's administering bank 6 weeks earlier. "Your husband's actual file shows full cognitive clearance," Ferris told Delia during their second meeting, sliding 2 documents side by side across the table. "No flagged concerns. No documented risk factors." His oncologist's notes specifically state, and I'm reading directly here, "Patient demonstrates complete cognitive function with no observed impairment throughout treatment course." That's about as clean a bill of mental health as a doctor can give. "And the other document?" Ferris turned the second page toward her. This is what was actually submitted to the Trust Review Committee 6 weeks ago, under Dr. Alderman's letterhead, with what appears to be his digital signature. It selectively quotes a single line from an entirely different section of his file, a routine note about temporary chemo-related fatigue affecting short-term concentration during one specific appointment, and presents it out of context, stripped of every surrounding clarification, as an ongoing cognitive concern. Delia stared at the document. Did Dr. Alderman actually authorize this version being sent? That's the question we needed answered next, so I called his office directly, identifying myself as part of your legal team investigating a records discrepancy. His office manager was, and I want to be precise about this, extremely alarmed. Dr. Alderman had no knowledge this summary document existed. He never authorized it, never signed it, and when I read him the language over the phone, he confirmed the summary misrepresents his actual clinical findings so significantly that he considers it fraudulent use of his name and license. Delia sat back in her chair, feeling something between vindication and nausea. So someone forged his signature and fabricated a medical summary using cherry-picked language from his real file. That's precisely what happened. And Delia, there's one more piece you need to see. Ferris pulled out a third document. This is the Trust's internal review log. Someone with administrative access submitted this fraudulent summary on August 14th. Your family's dinner conversation happened in October, which means the fraudulent document wasn't a future plan they were still developing that night. It was already sitting inside the Trust file system, waiting for the annual review to activate it. What you overheard wasn't them planning to commit the fraud. It was them confirming the fraud they'd already committed was still on schedule. Delia had assumed, walking into Odalise's office that first week, that she was uncovering a plan. She now understood she'd stumbled onto the tail end of an execution already well underway, and the realization sent something sharper than anger through her, something closer to the specific, focused clarity of a person who finally understands exactly what she's fighting and exactly how much time she doesn't have to waste feeling betrayed before she needs to start acting. Who has administrative access to submit documents into the Trust's review system? Delia asked. Ferris consulted his notes. 3 people are authorized. Marguerite Ashcombe, as Trust co-trustee, Holt Ashcombe, as the other co-trustee, and a designated legal representative for the Trust, currently listed as Petra Ashcombe, admitted to the State Bar, serving in that capacity since last year. Petra, not just a spouse sitting quietly at family dinners, but the Trust's actual designated legal representative, with direct administrative access to the exact system where the fraudulent document had been filed. Delia went home that night and sat across from Theo at their own small kitchen table, the one that had none of the Ashcombe family's polished mahogany grandeur, and told him everything. She played him the recording first, watching his face move through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked almost like physical pain as Petra's voice explained, in clean clinical language, how to weaponize his cancer diagnosis against him. They think I'm incompetent, Theo said quietly, staring at the phone on the table between them long after the recording had ended. My own family thinks I'm so far gone from chemo that they can just, vote me out of my own inheritance. They don't actually think that, Delia said gently. That's the part that matters, Theo. Dr. Alderman's Real file says you're completely fine. They know that. They forged a document specifically because the truth didn't give them what they needed. Theo was quiet for a long moment. So this was never about me being sick. It was about you. I think it started with you, Delia said carefully. But somewhere along the way, I became the actual target. Getting you excluded on medical grounds only works if it also gets me excluded as your spouse. I don't think this was ever really about protecting the family fortune from a supposedly incompetent heir, Theo. I think it was about making sure I never had a legal claim to any of it, using your illness as the mechanism. Theo put his head in his hands, and Delia watched her husband, a man who had survived 18 months of a disease trying to kill him, absorb the much slower, much colder realization that the people who'd sat beside his hospital bed had also, apparently, been quietly building a legal weapon out of that same illness the entire time. What do we do? He finally asked. We build a case so complete they can't argue their way out of it. And then we make sure everyone who matters hears exactly what I heard at that table. The next 4 months moved with a strange, controlled intensity. Odalise assembled a full legal team, and Ferris continued tracing the paper trail backward, uncovering that the falsified summary hadn't been an isolated act but part of a broader pattern. 2 other documents in the trust's file system, both submitted under Petra's administrative credentials, had similarly reframed innocuous medical and financial details about Theo's treatment expenses into language suggesting instability and financial recklessness, laying groundwork for a case that Theo's judgment, not just his cognition, couldn't be trusted. Delia learned that the family had also quietly opened a separate legal consultation 8 months earlier, before Theo's diagnosis had even been confirmed as treatable, exploring what Petra's own firm had internally labeled, in an email Ferris traced through a subpoenaed document request, succession contingency planning around TA's marital asset exposure. The timestamp made something in Delia go cold all over again. They'd started exploring how to exclude her from the family's money before they even knew whether Theo would survive his cancer at all. They were planning this regardless of whether I lived or died, Theo said when Odalise shared that document with them, his voice flat in a way Delia had never heard from him before. Not even during the worst weeks of chemo. If I'd died, this was probably about cutting Delia out of a widow's claim to trust assets. If I lived, it became about proving me incompetent instead. Either way, the actual plan was always just get rid of her. Delia spent those months documenting everything with the same methodical precision Odalise had taught her, keeping a written log of every interaction with the family, screen recording every group text where Marguerite pushed for another, "Family dinner soon, we miss you both." Never once suspecting Delia now understood exactly what those invitations were actually for. She attended 2 more Sunday dinners during that period, both times wearing the same cardigan with the same phone quietly recording in the pocket, and both times came home with additional fragments confirming the timeline, confirming Petra's role, confirming that Reagan, far from being an uninvolved bystander, had actually drafted the initial language reframing Delia's caregiving leave from the firm as evidence of erratic professional instability, in a memo Ferris eventually traced to her own laptop. By February, 6 weeks before the trust's annual review deadline the family had been racing toward, Odalise felt they had enough. Not just enough to defend against the fraudulent submission, but enough to go on offense entirely. "We have 2 paths," Odalise explained during their final strategy meeting before the trust review. "We can quietly submit our own evidence to the trust committee, correcting the record and protecting your position without public confrontation. Or we bring this into the open, formally, in front of the full family and the trust's oversight board, and let the recording and the forensic evidence speak for itself in real time. They tried to destroy my marriage using my husband's cancer as a legal weapon," Delia said. "I want them to hear exactly what I heard. I want them to sit in a room and listen to their own voices confirm every single thing they did." Odalise smiled, the small, satisfied smile of an attorney who'd been hoping her client would choose exactly that option. "Then let's build the room." The trust review meeting took place in a conference room on the 14th floor of the bank managing the Ashcombe Family Trust, 6 weeks before the deadline Callum had mentioned that October night. Marguerite and Holt arrived expecting a routine annual formality. Callum and Petra arrived expecting the culmination of a plan they'd spent nearly a year quietly constructing. Reagan arrived last, distracted, checking her phone, entirely unprepared for what was about to happen in that room. Theo and Delia arrived together, along with Odalise and 2 additional attorneys from her firm, and took seats directly across from the family that had spent the past year deciding, in careful legal language, exactly how much of Delia's life could be erased for their convenience. The trust's oversight committee, 3 officers from the administering bank, along with an independent fiduciary counsel required for reviews of this size, sat at the head of the table. Petra, apparently still confident in her position as the trust's legal representative, opened by presenting what she described as routine documentation, supporting a standard reallocation recommendation for the committee's consideration. "Before we proceed with any recommendation," Odalise said, once Petra finished her opening remarks, "I'd like to submit evidence regarding the authenticity of certain medical documentation already in this trust's file system. submitted under Ms. Ashcombe's administrative credentials on August 14th of last year. Petra's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that hadn't yet reached full alarm because she still, clearly, believed whatever was coming could be managed. Odalise placed Ferris's forensic comparison on the table, the Real medical file beside the falsified summary, and let the independent fiduciary counsel review both documents in silence for a long moment before speaking again. Dr. Alderman's office has confirmed, on record, that he never authorized this summary document, that his actual signature was digitally forged, and that the language attributed to him misrepresents his clinical findings so significantly that he considers this both fraudulent and a violation of his medical license if it's allowed to stand unaddressed. The room went very quiet. Marguerite's face had gone pale in a way Delia had never seen at any of the family dinners she'd sat through over 6 years. Holt was staring at Petra with an expression that suggested he was learning, in real time, exactly how much his family's legal strategy had actually cost. "This is a misunderstanding," Petra said, her lawyer's composure cracking at the edges. The summary was based on a preliminary conversation with the medical team, and if there were transcription errors. "There's one more piece of evidence I'd like the committee to consider," Odalise said, cutting through Petra's explanation with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had been waiting months for exactly this moment. An audio recording, made inadvertently during a family dinner in October, in which several people in this room discuss, in specific and unambiguous terms, the plan to use falsified medical documentation to trigger a competency review timed specifically before this trust's annual assessment. Delia watched her mother-in-law's hand grip the edge of the conference table. "I'd like to play it now," Odalise said, "in its entirety, so this committee can evaluate the context and continuity of the conversation for themselves." Nobody objected. Nobody could find the words to object fast enough before Odalise pressed play, and for the next several minutes, the room sat in absolute silence as Callum's voice, tinny but unmistakable through the conference room speaker, explained the March timeline, as Petra's voice, clinical and precise, described the exact mechanism of the fraud, as Reagan's voice dismissed Delia's 6 years of marriage with the casual cruelty of someone discussing an inconvenient line item, as Marguerite's voice, warmest of all the voices in that room, delivered the sentence that had haunted Delia every single day since she'd first heard it. "She's been remarkably useful. Nobody questions a devoted wife's motives while she's still playing the devoted wife." The recording ended. Nobody spoke for a long moment. "That's out of context," Callum finally said, his voice considerably less confident than it had been at that dinner table. "You can't just. There is 40 minutes of continuous, unedited audio both before and after that section," Odalise said. "I'm happy to submit the entire recording for the committee's review, along with the full forensic timeline connecting the fraudulent August submission directly to the plan discussed on that recording. But I don't believe context is going to help your position here, Mr. Ashcombe." The independent fiduciary counsel, a stern woman named Ida Presnell who had been almost entirely silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "This committee will be referring this matter to the State Bar regarding Ms. Ashcombe's conduct, and to the appropriate authorities regarding potential fraud charges related to the falsified medical documentation. Effective immediately, Petra Ashcombe is removed from her position as the trust's legal representative, and this entire trust structure will be placed under independent audit before any further distributions or reviews proceed." Marguerite began to cry, not the tears Delia remembered from Theo's remission celebration, but something harder and more frightened. Holt sat perfectly still, staring at a spot on the table, apparently unable to look directly at either his wife or his children. Reagan had gone completely white, her phone finally, silently, forgotten in her lap. "Delia," Marguerite finally said, her voice breaking, "you have to understand, this was never personal, it was about protecting the families." "It was entirely personal," Delia said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she'd felt at any point over the past 4 months. "You forged a doctor's signature using my husband's cancer diagnosis to try to erase me from his life while he was still recovering from chemotherapy. I don't need you to explain the strategy to me. I heard the strategy, in your own voice at your own dinner table, discussing me like I was a line item to be removed." Theo, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire meeting, finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the particular weight of someone whose exhaustion had finally curdled into something closer to clarity. I spent 18 months fighting to survive, and the entire time, my own family was quietly deciding how to use that fight against the person who never left my side through any of it. I don't think there's anything left to say to any of you today. They left the conference room together, Delia and Theo, walking out past the family that had spent nearly a year quietly building a case against her while smiling across a dinner table every Sunday. Neither of them looked back. The months that followed moved with the particular, exhausting momentum of consequences finally catching up to actions that had, for a long time, seemed to be moving in perfect silence. Petra faced a formal state bar investigation that ultimately resulted in a lengthy suspension of her license, along with separate criminal charges for the forged medical documentation. Charges that eventually resolved in a plea agreement involving probation and a substantial fine, but which permanently ended her career as a trust attorney. Callum, whose administrative fingerprints appeared throughout the broader pattern of falsified financial characterizations, was formally removed as a beneficiary trustee candidate and faced his own separate civil liability within the family's now independently audited trust structure. Reagan, whose memo reframing Delia's caregiving leave had been the earliest documented piece of the plan, quietly settled a portion of her own future distribution as part of a broader legal resolution Odalise negotiated on Delia and Theo's behalf, an outcome that effectively acknowledged, in binding legal terms, exactly how much financial harm the family's fraud had been designed to inflict. Marguerite and Holt never faced criminal charges, though the independent audit that followed permanently restructured their authority over the trust, stripping their unilateral control, and installing independent oversight for every future distribution decision. Delia received an email from Marguerite 4 months after that conference room meeting. 3 paragraphs of careful, lawyerly apology that read, to Delia's eye, more like damage control than genuine remorse. She read it once and never responded. Theo, for his part, spent those months in a kind of quiet, complicated grief that had nothing to do with his cancer, and everything to do with finally understanding the true shape of the family he'd grown up trusting completely. He and Delia found a therapist who specialized in family financial betrayal, much like the specialist Naomi had eventually found in her own healing, and worked slowly through the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing people, but from realizing the people you thought you had were never quite who you believed them to be. I keep thinking about all those Sunday dinners, Theo told Delia one evening, nearly a year after the conference room meeting, as they sat together on the porch of the small house they'd bought after finally settling their portion of the trust dispute, a modest, sun-filled place 3 states away from the Ashcombe family's sprawling colonial estate. How many of those dinners were they already planning this? How long was I sitting at that table, while my own family was quietly deciding how to use my illness against the person who actually took care of me? I don't know, Delia said honestly. But I know what I do know now, which is more than I knew before. And I'd rather have the truth, even a truth this ugly, than keep sitting at a table believing something that was never real. Delia eventually turned the entire ordeal into something she hadn't expected. A small consulting practice helping other spouses and caregivers navigate exactly the kind of documentation, forensic tracing, and legal protection she'd needed during those 4 grueling months. She worked closely with Odalise's firm, bringing in clients who'd experienced their own versions of quiet, sophisticated family betrayal disguised as ordinary estate planning, and found, much to her own surprise, a sense of purpose in the work that felt entirely separate from anger, something closer to protection, closer to making sure fewer people had to discover, the way she had, that the family sitting across the dinner table might be quietly building a case against them. 2 years after that October dinner, Delia stood in her own kitchen, in her own small house, preparing a meal for a much smaller gathering, just her, Theo, and 2 close friends who'd stood beside them through the entire ordeal. There was no polished mahogany table, no quietly rehearsed cruelty hiding beneath careful conversation, no phone recording silently in her pocket, because she no longer needed to protect herself from the people sitting across from her. She thought sometimes about that 11-minute mark on the original recording, the moment everything shifted, and understood now that it hadn't actually been the moment her marriage or her family fell apart. It had been the moment she finally had proof of something that, on some quiet, unacknowledged level, she'd probably sensed for longer than she'd ever let herself admit. The recording hadn't broken anything that wasn't already broken. It had simply, finally, let her see it clearly enough to walk away. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Do you think Delia was right to bring the recording into a public confrontation? Or would you have handled the exposure differently? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week we're telling the story of a woman who discovered her fiancé's entire family had been secretly video recording their engagement party for a very different reason than anyone at the table ever suspected.